Welcome to the detailed demo video of the Adaptive Interface's MCD100 Mode C decoder. The MCD100 is an instrument that allows a pilot to see the altitude sent by an encoding altimeter or electronic altitude encoder module, sometimes called a blind encoder, to a transponder. It's called a Mode C decoder because a transponder reporting altitude information is said to be operating in Mode C. Before starting the demonstration, it might be best to review the operation of an altimeter. Almost all altimeters, whether mechanical or electronic, measure altitude by measuring air pressure. Air pressure is highest at sea level, and it decreases as one gets higher. A value called standard pressure is the average pressure of air at sea level. It is 29.92 inches of mercury, and it is the basis for all encoding altimeters. An encoding altimeter always reports an altitude of 0 feet when it measures an air pressure of 29.92 inches of mercury. It reports higher altitudes when it measures lower air pressures. Keep in mind that air pressure changes with weather, and it is usually a little higher or a little lower than 29.92 inches of mercury at sea level, and that can affect the readings of an altimeter. The dial of a normal aircraft altimeter allows you to adjust its altitude display to compensate for changes in air pressure. On the runway, an altimeter can be set to the actual field altitude, while in flight, an altimeter can be adjusted to the barometer settings given by a control tower or an ATIS report. Two things to keep in mind. An altitude encoder, whether it's part of an encoding altimeter or a separate module, always reports altitude based on standard pressure of 29.92 inches of mercury. And another thing, the altitude is always reported in 100-foot increments. That just happens to be the resolution of encoding altimeters, 100 feet. Encoding altimeters report altitudes under 32,000 feet to a transponder by using 10 digital signal lines. Altitudes above 32,000 feet may require an 11th or a 12th digital signal line, but most general aviation aircraft only use the 10 lines. Altitude information is encoded on these lines using a code called a Gillum code. An aircraft's altitude can be read by air traffic control every time its transponder gets interrogated. As stated before, altitudes are always reported using standard pressure. Altitudes are corrected by air traffic control based on the weather and the barometer setting of the area in which the aircraft is flying. The MCD100 works by monitoring the digital signal lines between an encoding altimeter and a transponder. It decodes them with its microcomputer, and it displays the decoded altitude on its LED display. Seeing the standard pressure or Mode C altitude is a good way to verify that the altimeter is functioning properly. But a better altitude to see is the corrected altitude, the altitude seen or calculated by the air traffic control. The MCD100 allows the local barometer setting to be entered and a corrected altitude to be displayed. Because the corrected altitude is within 100 feet of the true altitude of the aircraft, it's the display's default setting. It is now time to start the demo. For this demo, we have the MCD100 connected to an encoding altimeter. Some information to know. Adaptive Interfaces is in Colorado, and we are at an altitude of 4,970 feet. Right now, the encoding altimeter is sending an altitude of 5,100 feet. This is an altitude based on standard air pressure of 29.92 inches of mercury. But, like most regular altimeters in an airplane, the MCD100 allows you to adjust its altitude display based on the local barometer setting. Our local barometer, again, is 29.77 inches of mercury. If we step through the functions, we can see this. Again, we are at 29.77 inches of mercury, and we can set this barometer setting with the instrument, or we can set the barometer setting knowing that we are at a current altitude of 4,970 feet. which we are right now, and the instrument is set for that. If we go to the next function, we'll see that the instrument is reporting a corrected altitude of 5,000 feet. Again, we're at 4,970 feet. Encoding altimeters have a resolution of 100 feet, and therefore the 4,970 gets rounded up to 5,000, which is plus minus 100 feet of our actual altitude. To go through this demo, what we'll do is we'll describe the various functions of the instrument and the functions of the buttons. The functions of the instrument are basically the functions listed across the top and show what they are with the indicator lights. The first function, which is the default function of the instrument, is the alt or altitude function. This is the corrected altitude, which is mode C altitude information corrected by the local barometer setting. If you want to see what the raw data is from the encoding altimeter, you can go to the mode C function. Again, this is a raw uncorrected altitude. So, like other altimeters, you can enter a barometer setting into the instrument, which is the next function. Right now we're at 29.77 inches of mercury. And we're also at an altitude of 4,970 feet. Again, the barometer can be set either with a known barometer setting or a known altitude. Across the bottom, you'll notice that there are 4 buttons. The first button is labeled Function. As you press this button, you can move the instrument into its different functions. The next button is an up arrow. The one after that is a down arrow. When the instrument is in its normal operating mode, which is altimeter, the up-down arrows can be used to adjust the brightness of the display. And we can kind of do that right now. Step up the brightness, step down the brightness. And we'll use the lowest brightness setting right now because that's the brightness level that works best with the video. The fourth button is marked AA. This stands for altitude alert, and we'll go into that a little later. It is also an enter button. So, if you want to change a value on the instrument, say if we're going to change the barometer setting, we can change that setting by using the up-down arrows. And to get the instrument to actually remember that value and set it in, we would press the AA button or the enter button like this. The display flashes and the decimal points light up to let you know that that new value is the value that's being stored into the instrument. And because of the calculations of the instrument, this is actually based on the local barometer setting at an altitude of 4,950 feet. Now we know this isn't correct. We know that we happen to be at 4,970. So what we can do is we can actually go back to that altitude simply by adjusting the instrument with the up-down arrow to 4,970 feet, hitting the enter button. That altitude is now stored into the instrument, and if we step through the functions, we'll see that 1, we have a proper corrected altitude, we still have our raw mode C altitude, and it's calculated back to our known barometer setting of 29.77 inches of mercury. Now comes time to describe another feature of the instrument, which is its altitude alert function. This is indicated by the last indicator on the side here, and it's also engaged by using the AA button when we're in normal altitude reporting mode. The purpose of altitude alert is to help you maintain a cruising altitude. What the instrument will do is you can set the instrument into altitude alert mode when you're at a desired cruising altitude. Right now we'll say that we're cruising at 5,000 feet. We can engage the altitude alert function, and now the instrument will warn us if we get more than 200 feet high of our desired cruising altitude or 200 feet low of our desired cruising altitude. This can be demonstrated by changing the air pressure going into the encoding altimeter. What we'll do is we'll lower the air pressure a little bit to show what the instrument does when the altitude goes too high, and we can increase the air pressure to the altimeter to show what the instrument does low. First, we'll raise the altitude. As you can see, when the altitude becomes more than 5,200 feet, the instrument will flash and let you know that you've drifted off of your desired altitude. The same thing can happen if we go too low. And again, the altitude jumps around a little bit because I'm changing the air pressure going into the encoding altimeter. This function can be turned on and off. Once you turn the function off, if you're at a new altitude that you're cruising at, you can re-engage the function, and that will be your new desired cruising altitude, and everything will be based relative to that as far as being too high and too low. There are other functions of the instruments, basically option settings. To get to the option settings, you press and hold the function button for about 8 seconds, and it now goes into what we call level 1 or menu level 1. The main operating mode of the instrument is considered menu level 0. So let's go through some of the functions that are available and the option settings that are available on the instrument. Right now we are looking at a display brightness setting. Right now it's set for front panel. That means that the up and down arrows will adjust the brightness of the digital display. We have other options with the instrument. If we go use the up and down arrows now, we can step through the various brightness control options. pH means photocell. There's a small photocell at the bottom of the instrument, and now the display brightness, if that's entered, can be controlled by the ambient light. So if you're in bright sunlight, the instrument will have a high brightness. If you're in an evening or a nighttime condition, the display brightness will get lower, and that does that automatically using the photocell. Another option is external brightness control. If you're in this mode, you can have a potentiometer on your instrument panel control the actual brightness of the instrument, and again that would be controlled by a control knob. And if we go back, we're back into the front panel mode, which is what we'll leave the instrument at right now because we can actually adjust the display brightness using the up-down arrows. The next function, and it's a little hard to see here, but it actually is AD off. AD is the auto dim function. When the instrument is set for front panel display brightness control, you can engage the auto dim function, and that will use a combination of the front panel controls and the photocell to change the brightness of the instrument automatically if you go into a, say, from a low light condition to a high light condition, darkness into bright sunlight. The photocell, even though you're in manual front panel control, will automatically bump up the brightness of the instrument automatically. After that, you can still use the front panel controls to do adjustments on the brightness. So the options for auto dim is to either have the function on or off. We'll leave it off right now and step over to the next function. This is SB off or strobe off. In some cases, encoding altimeters and transponders require a separate digital line called a strobe line. This line is pulled active when the transponder wants the altitude information. And when you're using a combination like that, you don't want this thing to display anything unless it's actually being asked to display it. In other words, when the transponder requires an altitude and requests it, it will pull the strobe line active, and then the MCD100 will then show the new altitude or update its altitude information only when there's a strobe line. Most encoding altimeters and transponders do not use the function, the strobe function, so right now the default setting is off. But we can set that to on as well and enter it if we wish to. Again, we'll just go ahead and leave it as an off function since most encoding altimeters don't use it. The last function is basically a return to main function, and that's indicated like sort of a double back arrow. And in order to do that and engage that, we actually use the enter button, or the AA altitude alert button. And what this will do is it'll bring us back to what we call menu level 0, which is actually the normal operating mode of the instrument. And it'll show you that you're going back to level 0. Now we're back to the normal operating mode of the instrument here. So again, we can step through our functions. Our default function, again, because it's more useful information to have a corrected altitude and know the actual altitude that you're flying at than to see your raw mode C altitude. The default of the instrument is to show the corrected altitude, and after a while, if other functions are selected, the instrument will time out and go back to the default value, so that you always have to select the mode C value if you wish to see it. And again, we can kind of step through these functions right now. Again, corrected altitude of 5,000 feet, raw mode C altitude of 5,100 feet. Again, we can set the barometer setting on the instrument if we wish. And something to note, that unless you hit the enter button, this value will not be registered into the instrument. So if we continue on going with the functions without actually entering this value, we'll be back at the default, the values that were previously entered into the instrument. Same thing with like the field altitude setting. If we don't hit the enter button, it actually goes right back to the old values, and we can see that again. Raw data of 5,100 feet, the old barometer setting of 29.77, and the field altitude of 4,970 feet. And that concludes the demo of this instrument, and we hope that this information is useful to you. Thank you very much.